There is a place where privacy, intimacy, integrity and worthlessness are guaranteed, the body, a unique temple and a familiar territory of sensations and personal history. The torturer attacked, contaminated and defamed the sanctuary. She does this publicly, intentionally, repeatedly, and often sadistically and sexually, with unpleasant contentment. Hence the lasting, long-lasting, and often irreversible effects and consequences of torture. In a way, the victim's own body of torture became her worst enemy. It is the bodily suffering that forces the patient to mutate, his identity fragmented, his ideals and principles crumble. The body becomes an accomplice to the oppressor, an unrelenting channel of communication, a territory of a deceitful and poisonous one. This creates an embarrassing prospect for the abusive author. The victim mistakenly sees the physical needs, sleep, bath, food, water, as the direct causes of their destruction and death. As he sees it, he becomes bestial not because of the sadistic oppressions around him, but because of his own flesh. The concept of body can be easily extended to family or home. Torture is often applied to family and friends, relatives or colleagues. It is intended to cover the continuation of surroundings, habits, looks, relationships with others, as the CIA puts it in one of its manuals. A cohesive sense of self-identity depends on familiarity and fluidity. By attacking both the biological body and a social body, the victim's psyche strains to the point of dissociation. Beatrice Patsalides describes this transformation as follows in Ethics of the Unspeakable: survivors of torture in psychoanalytic treatment, as the gap between me and me deepens, diversity and diversity increase. The subject who, under torture, is forced into the position of pure matter has lost his sense of being internal, intimacy, and privacy. Time is experienced today, only in the present, and perspective, which allows a sense of relativity, is excluded. Thoughts and dreams attack the mind and attack the body as if its protective skin basically contain our thoughts, give us space to breathe between the thought and the thing that you think, and it separates in and out, past and present, you and I are gone.
Anger robs the victim of the most basic ways of dealing with reality and is therefore equivalent to cognitive death. Space and time are disturbed by lack of sleep. I is broken. The tortured ones have nothing familiar to handle: family, home, personal property, loved ones, language, names. Gradually, they lose their mental hope and sense of independence. They feel strange, unable to communicate, relate, bond, or empathize with others. Splitters of torture enliven the early childhood narcissistic fantasies of uniqueness, omnipotence, invulnerability, and impenetrability. But it enhances the fantasy of fusion with one designed and powerful, though not benign, other, the cause of suffering. The dual process of individualization and separation is reversed. Torture is the last act of indecent friendship. The torturer attacked the victim's body, interrupted his thinking, and possessed his mind. Left out of contact with others and hungry for human interaction, the victim associates with the predator. Traumatic bonding, similar to Stockholm Syndrome, is about hope and the search for meaning in the brutal, indifferent, and subtle world of torture cells. The abuser becomes a black hole in the middle of the victim's surreal expanse, absorbing the victim's universal need for comfort. The victim tries to control her persuader by being one with her, interjecting him, and appealing to the monster's likely nature and empathy. This link is particularly strong when the torturer and the torturer form a dyad and cooperate with the rituals and acts of torture. For example, when the victim is forced to choose the implications of torture and the types of torture to be miserable, or to choose between two evils. Psychologist Shirley Spitz offers this powerful general overview of the contradictory nature of torture in a seminar entitled The Psychology of Torture, 1989. Torture is obscene, because it unites the most private with the most public. The torture involves all separation and the deepest sadness of privacy without any of the usual security measures. Torture implies everything of exposure at the same time to the general public, irrespective of the possibilities of camaraderie or shared experience, the presence of a powerful other merger, without the security of other evil intentions. Another indication of torture is his abandonment of intimate relationships with humans. Interrogation is a type of social gathering in which the normal rules of communication, and contact are manipulated. The need to rely is carried out by the inquirer, not so that they can be met as in a close relationship, but rather discouraged and confused. The freedom offered in exchange for treason is a lie. Silence has been intentionally misinterpreted as confirmation of information or as a violation of complexity.
Caution combines complete embarrassing exposure to devastating isolation. The ends of the product and the result of torture are a scarred and often broken victim and empty display of electric fiction. Obsessed with endless reflection, insane pain and a continuation of insomnia, the victim recovers, removing all defense mechanisms, except the most primitive: excitation, narcissism, dissociation, projective identification, introjection and cognitive dissonance. The victim is building an alternative world, often suffering from depersonalization and derealization, hallucinations, ideas of reference, delusions and psychotic stages. Sometimes the victim craves pain, just as self-mutilators do, because it is a test and reminder of their individuality, which is not obscured by relentless torture. The disease protects the victim from falls and capitulation. It preserves the reality of unimaginable and unimaginable experiences. The double process of isolation and addiction to the victim's grief fits the author's vision of her victim as inhuman or subhuman. The torturer assumes the position of sole authority, the exclusive source of meaning and interpretation, the source of both evil and good. Torture consists of reprogramming the victim to surrender to an alternative world exegesis, offered by the abuser. It is a profound, unworkable and traumatic act of indoctrination. The abuse also consumes the whole and condones the oppressive view of her, and often becomes suicidal, self-destructive, or destructive as a result. Therefore, torture has no deadline. The sounds, the voices, the smells, the sensations faded after the episode, the nightmares and the waking moments ended. The victim's ability to trust other people, that is, to assume that his motives are at least justified, if not necessarily benign, cannot be altered weakly. Social institutions are seen as precisely on the brink of a well-known Kafkaesque shrink. Nothing is safe or credible. Victims often respond by unveiling the emotional numbness and increasing arousal, insomnia, irritability, anorexia, and lack of attention. Memories of traumatic events interrupt in the form of dreams, night terrors, flashbacks and stressful associations. Those who are tortured are having to resort to forced rituals to defend themselves against prejudiced thoughts. Other reported psychological sequences include cognitive decline, reduced learning ability, memory disorders, sexual dysfunction, social isolation, inability to maintain long-term relationships, or even intimacy. Internal phobias, ideas of reference and superstition, delusions, hallucinations, micro-episodes. Psychotic and emotional planes. Depression and anxiety are common. These are the forms and manifestations of self-aggression. The patient was angry with his own victim and the resulting multiple dysfunction. She is ashamed of her new disabilities and is responsible, or even at fault, in a way, for her difficult situation and the terrible consequences of her nearest and dearest. Their sense of self-esteem and self-esteem are paralyzed.
Simply put, victims of torture suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Their strong feelings of anxiety, guilt, and shame are also common in victims of child abuse, domestic violence, and rape. They feel anxious because the author's behavior seems unreasonable and unpredictable, or regularly mechanical and inhumane. They feel guilty and disrespectful because, in order to restore a sense of order to their destruction in the world and a minimum of control over their chaotic lives, they must cause their own self-loathing and their competitors' oppressions. The CIA, in the Human Resources Exploitation Training Manual, 1983, published in the April 1997 issue of Harper's Magazine, provided a summary of the following theories of coercion. The purpose of all persuasive techniques is to provoke a psychological regression to the subject by applying a superior external force to execute their will to fight. Regression is usually a loss of autonomy, a reflecting on a previous level of behavior. The subject retreated, their learned personality traits diminished in reverse order. They began to lose the ability to perform higher tasks creatively, to deal with complex situations, or to deal with stressful interpersonal relationships or repeated failures. It is unlikely that after the torture, its victims will feel helpless and powerless. Loss of control over life and body has been shown to be physical inactivity, lack of attention, and insomnia. This is often exacerbated by the disbelief that many victims of torture face, especially if they cannot produce shreds or other purpose evidence of their suffering.
Language cannot communicate an experience so privately as pain.
Spitz makes the following observations: the pain is also unstable because it is resistant to language. All of our inner states of consciousness, emotional, perceptive, cognitive, and somatic, can be described as having something in the external world. It proves our ability to transcend our physical limitations to the outer and inner world.
This is the space in which we interact with our environment. But when we explore the inner physical state pain, we find that there is no object out there, not external, reference content. The pain is not from, or at all. Pain is.
And it takes us out of the contact space, the shared world, into.
It will take us to the limits of our body.
Viewers are angry with the oppressed because they make them feel guilty and are ashamed of doing nothing to prevent the violence. Victims threaten their sense of security and their crucial belief in predictability, justice and law enforcement.
The victims, for their part, do not believe that it is possible to effectively communicate with the strangers they have experienced. The torture chambers are another galaxy.
This is how Auschwitz described author K. Zetnik in his testimony at the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961.
Kenneth Pope in Turtles,
a chapter he wrote for Encyclopedia of Women and Gender, Sexual Similarities and Differences and the Impact of Society on Sex, quotes Harvard psychiatrist Judith Herman. It's very intriguing on the part of the perpetrator.
All the perpetrators asked was that the viewer did nothing.
It demanded universal desire not to see, hear, and speak ill. The victim, on the contrary, asked the viewer that share the burden of pain.
The victim needs action, commitment and memory.
But, more often, ongoing attempts to suppress fearful memories result in psychosomatic illness, conversion. The victim wants to forget the torture, avoid re-experiencing the frequent abuse of life, and protect her human environment from shocks. In relation to the broad uncertainty of the victim, it is often translated as hypervigilance or even paranoia.
The victims did not seem to win. Torture is forever.
Note: why do people suffer? We must recognize functional torture among the various sadistic. The first is calculated to extract information from the tortured or to punish them. He is measured, impartial, efficient, and unselfish. The latter, the sadistic variety, satisfies the emotional needs of the author. People who are trapped in anomalous states, for example, soldiers in war or incarcerated prisoners, tend to be out of control and isolated. They experience a slight or total loss of control. They become weak, powerless, and helpless from events beyond their influence. The value of torture in exercising the full and widespread dominance of victimhood. It is a coping strategy used by the oppressed who want to regain control of their lives, and thus restore their dominance and efficiency. By conquering the oppressed, they regained their self-confidence and regulated their sense of self-confidence. Other torturers release their negative emotions, aggression, humiliation, anger, envy, spreading hate, and drive them away. The victim becomes a symbol of all that is wrong in the life of the torturer and the situation in which he is incarcerated. The act of torture is the value of a violent and wrongful death. Many commit harmful acts because of a desire to act. Torturing others is their way of showing obedience to authority, group affiliation, camaraderie, and adherence to both the ethical code of conduct and common values. They enjoy the accolades accumulated by their superiors, co-workers, colleagues, teammates or collaborators. His need to overcome was not so great that he could overcome ethical, moral, or legal considerations. Many criminals derive pleasure from sadistic acts of shame. For them, suffering pain is fun. They lack empathy, so their victims' intense reactions are caused by a lot of excitement. Moreover, sadism has its roots in deviant sexuality. The torture perpetrated by the sadist was intended to involve perverted sex, rape, lesbian, voyeurism, exhibitionism, pedophilia, fetishism, and other paraphilias. Aberrant sex, unlimited energy, excruciating pain, these are the intoxicating substances of the sadistic variant of torture. However, suffering rarely occurs without the sanction and blessing of the authorities, whether local or national. A permissible environment is sine qua non. The more abnormal the circumstances, the less the environment, the additional crime scene comes from public scrutiny, more likely to occur. This is especially true in totalitarian societies where the use of physical force to discipline or eliminate dissent is an acceptable practice.